Good afternoon. In our series on software engineering, we have been talking about project planning. Today we will be talking about a very important part of project planning, that is risk management. So we are well aware that risks are a common feature in our everyday life. So we mitigate risks, we encounter risks, we have strategies how to handle the risks, and in every aspect of our day-to-day functioning and also in all the projects, there is some or the other form of risk involved. So today we are going to talk about specifically what is the strategy, what is risk management in the domain of software engineering when we are talking about large software projects. What are the main risks that these projects are susceptible to, and what is the framework to manage these risks, as in how do we assess what these risks are, how do we identify these risks, how do we come to know what is the probability of each of these risks, and then we also try to see how we can control these risks, or how we can monitor, how we can have a strategy to mitigate with this kind of risk. So all this comes under the major domain of risk management. So basically, if we talk about risks, what is basically risk management? So when we are talking about risk management, we are trying to say that we are minimizing the chances of failure which could be caused by any unplanned event in the projects which are undertaken. So it could be anything which is happening which was not planned or which was not thought of, and which is going to hamper the result, which is going to affect or impact the smooth functioning or scheduling of the project. Scheduling could be, it could impact the time schedule, it could impact the cost schedule, it could impact the effort schedule. So any which way it is going to impact the project schedule. So basically when we talk about risk, so for smaller projects the risk involved is also less because the time span is less, the scope of the project is small, so therefore the risks involved are also less. But if you talk about large software projects, so this is one of the most important areas which needs to be taken care of, because certain unprecedented event may actually derail the project from the path it is moving on, and it can adversely affect the performance of the entire system. So basically the normal parlance, we try to have an optimistic overview and we say that no, nothing is going to happen, but we know that if something has to happen, it will happen. If something has to go wrong, it will go wrong. So based on this law, Murphy's law, we will always, large projects must have a proper risk management plan in effect before the project actually begins. Now risks basically they are probabilistic, so we are not sure whether the risk is going to take place, whether the event or whether this is going to happen or it is not going to happen. So basically the most important character here for risks is that these are probabilistic events and these have adverse effects on the cost, quality or schedule of the project. So basically the risk exposure is the chance of injury or loss. What is the probability that an injury will occur? What is the probability that the loss will occur is calculated by the risk exposure. So risk exposure means the amount of loss which is going to happen because of a probable, unforeseen or an unwanted event. So basically these are infrequent events and they are out of the control of the normal project management. So there are certain events which are perceived, which are understood, which are anticipated, like for example a team member being on leave. So that is something the project management can easily handle. But for example, if a certain critical member of the team who is the only member who is having the knowledge of working on a specific tool, he quits the job and goes. So that is a major risk. So this kind of risk cannot be mitigated. A change in requirements is a normal due course which the project management can handle, but a major change in the statutory environment or a major delay due to some external agency could be a risk which is difficult to mitigate with. So we can see that basically these risks are infrequent, they are probabilistic. These are a few important features of events which are termed as the risk events in case of software management. So basically, generally we say that why do software projects fail? So because when we are talking about risk, we need to know that what is it that makes what are the main root causes which lead to the failure of a software project. So it could be that the software could never run, or the software executed, it performed some functions but not all expected functions were accomplished, or it was not delivered on time, so it did not meet the time schedule, so it was way behind that, or it has costed higher cost in terms of time or effort than it was expected, so the cost calculations have gone wrong. Okay, so this is, there is now what are the reasons for these failures? This is a very complex situation. There could be multiple reasons for this. There could be a communication gap between the different parties which are involved, the clients, the software team, or the interrelations between the one and the other systems are there. There is some external linkages of the system which are not working in place, which were not delivered in time, or there is always this, and there is an uncertainty in the objective. It wasn't clear in the very first go, the requirements were not clearly understood. So there could be several reasons for which which lead to the failure of a software project. So basically, now these risk factors which we are discussing, these fall into two broad categories. We can classify them as two broad categories. First category of risks is called the generic risks. Generic risks are the risks which are common to all software projects, and then there could be certain project specific risks also. So these are basically those risks which are highly specific in nature and which are key to one or two or specific kind of the project which is being undertaken. So there's these both the points of view, they must in any case, whether it is a generic risk or it is a project specific risk, it is very important, it is a key feature to take a comprehensive view of both these types of risks which the project may be exposed to. So some of the important and the most common software risks are, firstly, the ambiguous improvement targets are there. That is, ambiguity in requirement planning, ambiguity in requirement specification is one major reason, because you do not know what the client wants. So then there is certainly going to be a problem in the execution. Then the user requirements keep coming in and they keep changing their requirements. So this is another major software risk, because of this the proper execution of the project will not take place. Then we have crowded office conditions are there. That is, the workplace or the work environment is not feasible for a proper project to be executed. Then there is if the real unrealistic time scheduling has been done by the top management. That is, the people who prepared the time schedule, they were not sure of, they did not have the complete knowledge of how the project is going to be developed, how much time is required for each activity. So then therefore the project runs out of schedule, they are not able to meet the deadlines. So because of that also there is too much pressure which can cause the project to fail. Then you take excessive time to market the project. The marketing of the project is one phase of the project, but if too much of it has been effort and money has been spent on it, definitely. Then if the unrealistic expectations were made or unrealistic cost estimations were done, it was not done correctly, the reviews were not done properly, proper models were not used, proper mathematical tools and techniques were not used for estimation of cost in terms of time, money and effort. If they were not done properly, then this can lead to a lot of trouble in the software development functioning. Then another very important reason is the human aspect of it. That is, if there is lack of coordination between the teams, whether it is the client and the software team, or between the software management and the senior executives, or between the different stakeholders of the different teams who are working on different parts of the project. So if there is lack of coordination and there is lack of understanding between these teams, then of course there is going to be a little trouble with the project, and the project might be susceptible to some sort of loss or some sort of failure in the project. If you have unrealistic optimism, that is another problem, that the management or the team management or the project planner assumes things which may not be true. He is assuming that the people will be ready to work over time, or there will be nobody who leaves the job and goes, or all the external elements which are involved in the project will deliver their items on time. So such unrealistic optimism may also lead to a lot of problems in the execution of the software project. So these are some of the common risk factors which software projects are generally prone to, or they may meet. There is a comprehensive list of the risk factors which can be studied in the relevant literature, so which gives a comprehensive checklist for the teams to study and to see which particular type of risks are more probable in a specific environment, in a specific kind of project situation, and which are less likely to occur. So accordingly, the risk management plan is prepared. Then if we talk about specific risk causes, like these were some general risk causes which are commonly found in all projects, but if we talk about a specific risk cause, which is when a project is successful, it is not because there was no problem, but it is because that the problems were overcome. So basically you need to have a strategy in place. If you have problems, what are you going to do? So when you talk about strategy, there are two types of primarily there are two types of strategies which are adopted. One strategy is the proactive strategy, that is, you act in anticipation. Before the problem occurs, you can foresee that the problem is going to take place, and then you are more proactive. You identify the potential problem and you act quickly before the problem actually occurs. The other strategy is reactive strategy, in which we wait until the problem has occurred and only then we react to that situation. Once the problem has occurred, then we act and we try to solve the problem, or we try to overcome with the impact of that particular problem. That is a recovery kind of a thing. So basically it depends on the type of risk which are involved, because there are some risks for which you cannot have a proactive approach. There are certain unprecedented events which you cannot foresee, like natural disasters. So though for those you have to have a reactive approach, but there are some events like employee leaves the job and goes, or something like that. So for that you can obviously have a proactive approach, because that's one of the common kind of problem in the industry. So one can always have a team of people ready, so that if one goes, the other employees are ready with the same set of skills, so that they can easily take over. So it depends, basically which strategy you are using depends on the specific scenario of the project and of the people, and the way the people are planning things, that what kind of strategy they would like to address in case of these risks. So basically when you talk about risk management, so there are specific steps that we generally follow. So the first and the most important step is to identify and assess the risk. So first is that you find out what are the specific risks which your project is going to face. Then you assess the probabilities and the effect of those risks on the project. One is what is the risk, then the next thing is what is the probability that the risk will occur, and also what is the impact, what is the loss that the project is going to face because of that specific kind of risk. Next is to develop the strategies to mitigate the identified risk. After that, we have to monitor those risk factors, keep on monitoring the risk factors, because we know that with time the risks will always change. Then we always have a contingency plan in place, so that if the risk is happening, if the risk is taking place, what is going to happen. Then we have Finally, we have a risk management, or how to manage when the crisis has occurred, and then to recover from the crisis which has occurred, and to take an afterthought and to take an action plan once the recovery of the crisis is taking place. So these are the prominent steps which generally, the procedures which are generally followed. These are the standard procedures which are followed. So basically, if you see here, we are talking about a risk management plan. So in the risk management plan, we talk about two aspects. First is the assessment of the risk, in which we will talk about the aspects of risk identification. Then we have risk analysis, in which we also find out the probability of the risk occurring, and then is the prioritization of the risk, that is, which risks need how much attention. The next phase in risk management is of risk control, where we talk about risk management planning, where the overall planning is done in order to control the risk. Then we have risk resolution, and finally we have the risk monitoring. So these are the 6 phases in which the entire risk management plan is executed, it is prepared, and finally it is put in place. So first step in this is risk assessment. That is, in this step we are identifying what are the risks, then we are prioritizing these risks based on their probability. So there could be certain risks which are low priority risks, which will which have, because they have low probability, or because the damage that they are going to cause to the project is less. Then after prioritizing the list, we get a list of the high priority risk which need immediate attention, and then we get the risks for which lesser number of resources are to be dedicated, and which require low attention of the user. So most these risks, basically this risk assessment is most required, as in other steps also it is most required towards the starting of the project, because we know that the cost and the effort which goes in the initial phases of the project is much higher than in the later phases of the project. So basically risk assessment is also required to be done early. But another problem is that it is difficult to anticipate the risks in the beginning, to foresee what risks the project is going to face in the beginning as compared to in a later stage. So in a way it is a paradoxical situation, because when the assessment is required, it is more expensive to assess, and when it becomes easier to assess, then the need for that kind of assessment is quite less. So in identification of risk, basically it is the job to visualize the project development and identify what will go wrong, what are the things which can go wrong. So in this case there are specific techniques which are used by the project planning department or by the software engineering team, like we can use a checklist, or the surveys, meetings, brainstorming can be done, or reviews, etc. can be done. So for example, if there is a checklist which is prepared by continuous meeting, interviews with the previous teams which have worked on similar kind of projects, and what are the risks that they had faced, and this kind of comprehensive checklist gives a ready document to the project planners to see what are the anticipated risks which may be relevant to the current scenario. Then there are several other techniques which are also used. Another important technique could be a review of the previous projects which have been taken, so that if any failures have been occurred, then they can also understand what were the reasons for those failures. So one important example for this could be a personnel shortfall. So if there is less number of people, or there are people who are not meeting the required skill set, so in this case this is a very important risk which needs to be identified, and this can only come in from if you have a past experience, or you already have met people by interviewing or by surveying, by preparing a checklist through these surveys, so that you get to know what is the probability of meeting this personnel shortfall and how do you mitigate that risk. So basically all these important techniques are used for identification and for finding out what are the risks which are relevant. So basically we must there should be a difference between the cause, that is the risk factors, their problems and their symptoms. So whether you identify a situation as a risk or an opportunity, basically it depends upon one's point of view also. So therefore we also have certain, we have an important saying, like we say no risk no gain. So if there is a project which has a high potential for failure, then it also has a very high potential for a high payback. So if the team is daring enough and they go for a project which is a very high risk item, and if they are able to deliver it successfully, then it may also be a compliment to the team, and it may also have help them in their future endeavors. So basically, identification of risk is going to be an added advantage, because it will help in foreplanning of an event which may or may not occur. So besides this, there are other tools which are also taken for risk identification, like decision driver analysis. Now whatever decisions which are taken with regard to a project, they should be technical and management oriented decision. But if there is any other force which is driving a particular decision, like it could be politics, or it could be a business, it could be a profit making venture, or it could be any kind of external pressure which leads to a specific decision, then that decision, if the driver for the decision is any other reason besides a management and a technical reason, then this is something to be wary of, and this can be a major risk factor in the project. Then another is assumption analysis, that is on what assumption are the decisions being taken, or on what assumptions is the project being based. So are these assumptions some unrealistic assumptions, which are over optimistic assumptions which may not be true, like assuming that everything is going to be correctly in place, every employee will give his best, and you will find whatever tools and resources are required will be available well in time. So such kind of unrealistic and over optimistic assumptions may lead to a great amount of risk. Another is decomposition of the project. So basically, decomposition, we mean that we are dividing and conquering the project. So we can divide the project into separate activities, and if this decomposition is not done properly, if this decomposition, the division of activities or processes has not been done wisely, or has not been done correctly, then further it can lead to a lot of risk factors in the project, because if individual elements or individual activities of the project are going to suffer, certainly it is going to have an impact on the overall performance of the project. So if each component is not being covered according to the schedule, then there is bound to be a lapse or a delay in the deadline. So therefore, these tools, other tools like decision driver analysis or assumption analysis or decomposition, etc., can also be used to identify the potential risks which are there in the project, which the project may be forced to, may be prone to. Now, after the risks have been identified, a careful analysis of all the risk factors is done, a careful study of the risk factors is done, and the priorities for each of these items is set. So we divide the risk according to high priority risks and low priority risks. So high priority risks are those risks for which greater attention, more resources are dedicated, and which have the potential to cause more harm. So basically, in risk analysis, we first evaluate the probability of the problem. What is the chance that the problem is going to occur? Then we evaluate the effect of that problem or loss would have on the project's desired outcome. That is, what is going to be the impact? How much damage is that particular problem going to cause? Then we will classify the risk with the risk exposure or the impact. So basically, the risk exposure is calculated as a function of probability and as a product of probability and the loss of the unwanted event. So what is the probability that the risk will occur, that the problem will occur, and what is the loss? If you take a product of these two, what you get is the risk impact. So basically, risk impact is a measure of how much loss the risk is going to cause to the, how much loss a particular risk is going to cause to the project. So basically, higher the risk impact or higher the risk exposure, higher is the probability of the risk item. So therefore, more attention is to be given to the risks which have a higher risk impact or a risk exposure than those which have a lower risk exposure. So as a consequence, therefore we can identify after this exercise, we can identify what are the more important risks and what are the lesser important risks. So those risks which are more important, they are put high in the list order, and therefore they will need immediate attention of the project planners. So not all the problems they have same probability, not all the problems they have the same impact. So it's evaluating the probability is because sometimes it is difficult. So therefore what is used is similar cases as examples or illustrations are used. So these may be used for creating a precedence, and you understand that if this same situation occurred in the other projects, what was the impact, how much loss was occurred. And the other way is to find out the optimistic, pessimistic and the most probable scenario. So we basically, simulation tools are used for these purposes to understand the impact of a specific kind of risk. So in optimistic, we find out that what is the probability when nothing wrong is going to happen. Pessimistic, we assume that yes, the risk is going to happen, there is a very high probability, and more probable event is that the realistic evaluation of the situation is done, and then we understand this problem. So basically, after the risk identification and risk assessment has been done, the next phase that we see is risk control. Now risk control is basically the strategy of seeing that what is the identified risk has been done. Now we will see how we can mitigate or how we can control the risk which is there. This can be either we can control the risk itself or minimize the chance of the occurrence of the risk, or at least try to minimize the damage which the risk is going to cause. So project planners, they use different strategies for risk controlling. One of the strategies is risk avoidance. So risk avoidance is a strategy in which we assume we try to completely avert the chance that a risk will occur. It is something like building a house in an area where in order to avoid a risk of earthquake, you build a house in an area which is absolutely earthquake safe. So in most of the projects, however, this strategy may not work because there are potential risks for every project. So therefore, if risk avoidance is not what can be done, the next is risk mitigation. That is, risk mitigation means that we take up active measures which will minimize the effect of the risk. So we are trying to minimize the occurrence of the risk, and if the risk occurs, we are trying to minimize the effect of the risk. So risk perception is affected by risk mitigation steps which are undertaken, because we see that risks are very dynamic in their nature. Risks are dynamic and they need to be they are always required to be monitored and evaluated, because risks, they will change from time to time. In the same project, the risks which are which are available or which are exposed today may not be there tomorrow. So there is a constant need to keep on evaluating and to keep on monitoring what is the risk at the present time, and then devise strategies and mechanism to control those risks which are at the moment which are required. So this basically risk perception will also be affected by the mitigation steps which are undertaken. So if you have a strong risk mitigation plan in place, then the perception of risk will be taken by the project planners or by the software engineering team will also be different. So basically, there are two types of strategies which are developed to mitigate the identified risk. First is the action planning. So in action planning, what we do is that we address the risks that can be mitigated by immediate response. That is, quick action can be taken against a risk which has occurred. So for example, if one of the vendors is not able to supply the required hardware item, then we have another vendor, and we can ask the hardware item, we can order it from the other person. And the other strategy which is adopted for mitigating risk is contingency planning. So in this, we accept the risk, we plan, and then we try to control the risk there and there. So in this case, so we are going to talk about two different strategies. One is the ready action planning, and the other is the contingency planning. So in action planning, we try to vanish, or we try to minimize the risk. That is, we take the action before. It is a more proactive approach that is taken up. So before the risk occurs, we try to take in measures to control or to contain the impact of the risk. So for example, we are facing some problems with some new tools. So beforehand, a person is hired, or another worker is hired who can handle the new tools and techniques which have come in. So this kind of action planning can be done, which is a proactive approach to risk management, to risk mitigation, so that the complete effect of the risk on the project performance is absolutely minimized. In contingency planning, what is done is that the risk is accepted, we prepare a plan, and then we use the plan if the risk is materialized. So the actions are taken, that is, the variables are identified which control in order to detect that the problem is there. Then we create an action plan to be used during the crisis as a consequence of this problem, and planning the crisis recovery. So in contingency planning, basically we accepting the risk is going to happen, we are accepting that yes, the damage will be taken, but we have a proper plan in place to contain the risk and also to recover from the crisis which will occur due to the this kind of risk which is occurring immediately or unplanned sort of. So basically, we need to keep on monitoring what are the risk factors which are taking place. So we observed and identify the systems. We have certain control variables in the system which will always which will be used for detecting the presence of risk factors. And these symptoms can also be grouped, so that if there is any kind of delay in the quality or any kind of deviation in the product, in the project quality or cost or schedule, then that can be an alarm symptom and it can be detected well in time. So there should be quantifying in a precise manner with objective, timely and accurate metrics. So these risks should be quantified, and there should be clear control limits for the risk, and there should also be a tradability between the risk factors and the risk. So there are risk factors, but we should always try and see that these risk factors do not transform or do not get converted into a risk. So basically, risk monitoring is very important, because by this you get to know the changes in the risk pattern, the changes in the type of risk, the changes in the probability of risk which may occur. So for example, if there is a continuous risk on the project of requirement planning, but after a certain stage is done, after the development is done, then this kind of risk may reduce. Then there could be risk of the system not functioning as per the desired requirement. So therefore, the monitoring of risk factors is very important in each phase. So after the contingency plan has been prepared, the risk is there. So then you have quantitative risk indicators which cross a predetermined threshold. So you get to know that if these indicators are crossing the threshold, then there is a risk, there is a high need for attention. So there are different levels for this. There is an operative level, then we have the contingency plan will start after the correct situation is in place, and if the situation is not feasible, then the contingency plan also has to be stopped therein. So basically, after this, what happens is the crisis has occurred, the contingency plan also has a crisis management plan in it. So even if because of the team's best effort the contingency plan is failing and it could not be executed, so after the crisis is required, we see who are the people who have helped the company in managing that kind of crisis situation. Those people who have worked and who have brought the situation in control, they should be rewarded. There should be a re-evaluation of the cost and schedule in light of the resources which were drained due to the for managing the crisis which has come up. So after the crisis has occurred, there should be an effective recovery plan, and there should also be a post recovery plan to see that what kind of situation, what kind of people and what kind of resources have gone into the management of the crisis situation. So this is about completely about how the risks which are affecting the project, they can be identified, they can be assessed, and finally these risks can be controlled, and also the different ways in which the risk management or risk mitigation strategies can be used. So after the risk management planning has been done, the next and the final stage in case of project planning is project monitoring and tracking. So basically the project managers they execute a proper project monitoring scheme. They execute a number of activities which determine the action to ensure that the project goals are met. So if the project goals are not being met by in the terms of quality, in the terms of cost, or in the term of schedule, then the project monitoring team has certain kind of activities. They take certain kinds of steps, they undertake certain kinds of steps in order to ensure that all the goals of the project are met. So basically there are 3 levels of activities which are taken up by the project monitoring team. One is activity led monitoring, the second is status reporting, and the third is milestone analysis. So basically when monitoring is done, it is a 3-level activity. The first level is activity led monitoring, in which case a meeting of all the stakeholders or all the major important team leaders etc. and the people who are working on the project is held. This is actually on a daily basis. So after the end of the day, the activities of the day are summed up, and all these people, they see whether the activities were met according to the quality and cost schedule efforts or not. So this kind of monitoring is a day-to-day monitoring which is done. Next type of monitoring which is done is a status report monitoring, in which a weekly analysis of the work is done. So whatever work was completed in 1 week's time, the status report is filed and it is again reviewed and it is analyzed for any shortcomings or any shortfalls, and a corrective action if required is also suggested. And the third type of analysis which is done in project monitoring is a milestone analysis, which is done after a few weeks time has elapsed. So in this case, when important milestone has been achieved, then an analysis is done of the situation, of the current situation, and also future planning for the other milestones of the project is done in this particular phase. So basically in project monitoring, it will be a daily monitoring, a weekly monitoring, and it will be a, you can say, a fortnightly or monthly, or whenever a specific significant milestone of the project has been achieved, then the monitoring is done. So basically for this kind of monitoring also a specific project monitoring plan is prepared. So this project monitoring plan, it talks about what is to be measured, that is what is to be monitored, how often it is to be monitored, and what are the tools, techniques and paradigms which will be used for monitoring the situation or for measuring the quantities which are going to suggest or which are going to indicate the quality of the project. So basically measurement planning is effectively, it is done effectively to control the project, the functioning of the project, and to monitor that things are working as per schedule. So basically it is the schedule, the size, the effort and the defects in the term of quality, these are measured as a part of project monitoring plan. So they decide the actions to be taken so that the project goals are met. So whatever project goals are specified, they should be met. If they are not being met, then it is the function of the project monitoring plan to see what are the remedial steps to be taken so that the goals are met. So there are 4 basic activities which are associated with project planning. The first activity is software scope, that is to judge what is the scope of the software. The second is to see the resources, to plan the resources, to see whether the resources which are available or not, all the different types of resources. The third activity is estimation of the project in the terms of cost, in the terms of effort, and the fourth and the last activity is decomposition of the activities of the project. So decomposition could be based on processes or it could be based on products. So first thing that comes as part of the project monitoring plan is the scope, software scope. So basically software scope, we want to establish a project scope that is unambiguous and understandable at management and technical level. So the scope basically means what are the functions that the software is going to perform, what are the performance standards or the metrics of the software, what are the constraints or the conditions or the limitations under which the software will have to function, what are going to be the interfaces of the software with the external agencies or within the internal stakeholders or within the internal components of the system, and the reliability issues of the software. So basically when you talk about the software scope, all these aspects about the software need to be addressed, need to be described. Then the next thing which is discussed in the project monitoring plan is the resources. Now most estimate resources are required to accomplish the development effort. So there are 3 broad areas, 3 broad types of resources which are used in case of software development projects. One are the hardware resources, the second is the software resources, and the third type of resource is the people, which is the most critical of all the different resources which are used. So hardware and software tools, these are foundation of resource pyramid. If we think these are the basic things which are required, so they provide the basic infrastructure to support development of software projects. So it is basically an environment which is required for the development of the software, different computer softwares. So they must prescribe the time frame required for hardware and software, and we must verify that these resources will be available. So if certain specific types of hardwares are required for a particular project, so it should be made sure that the resources will be available within the specific time slam. So at what stage in the project a specific resource is required, the resource should be made available, and this should be ascertained by the project monitoring and controlling plan. So then there are some reusable software components, which is the next level, and these can reduce the development cost because these are already been developed and they can be reused. So these can greatly reduce the development time, development cost and effort. So basically you can use certain components which have been developed already and you can get the system running. And the highest in the pyramid of the resources is the people. So people basically mean the persons who are going to work on the project. So it is important, critically important to understand what are the required number of people in the project in different positions, and also what are the skill sets which are critical to a specific project, and the people who possess those skill sets should be available to work on that project, and they should be ready to work and deliver whatever effort is required. So the effort estimation in terms of skills of the people and numbers of the people should be correctly done. So when a monitoring is being done, it should be made sure that all these components of required for the development of an efficient software, that is hardware, software, reusable software components and people, they all should be in place. So each resource is specified with 4 characteristics. All these characteristics are become a part of the project planning, the project management plan. So this has description of the resource, the statement of the availability, what is the resource basically, why it is required in the specific project, what is the purpose of this resource, then whether these resources are available within the organization or whether they have to be obtained from outside the organization, and if so, what is the cost of that on the software project. Then chronological time the resource will be required, from what time to what time the resources are required, so that they can be released after that time, and there is a scheduling of resources also generally which is done in companies. So the scheduling can be done according to the time frame in which the resources are required in that specific project, and what duration for which the resource will be used. So basically it is a complete description of the requirement of a particular resource in this. So when you are doing this monitoring, the resource must be freed after the deadline for the resource is ended, and the resource will be available, because otherwise this is going to have a cascading effect on the other projects if there is some critical resource which is being shared by a number of software projects at the same time. The next is project estimation. So cost estimations must be provided upfront, okay, but the longer we wait, the more we know and the better is the estimate. So when we are calculating the estimates of the cost, for different stages the cost estimations are to be done, but these estimations are to be done at the beginning, because generally these estimations are done at the beginning, and if the project is not meeting those estimates, then that kind of difference or that kind of deviation between the estimated cost and the actual cost will be calculated. But the problem is that if you do the estimation in the very early phases, it becomes difficult, because it is difficult to anticipate for future, but and if you do it at a later stage, those estimates are nearly useless. So basically when the project monitoring plan is created, there should be correct and realistic estimations for the costs and the efforts. So then for this we can use different kinds of techniques for estimation of cost and for estimation of efforts which are used. So one of the common techniques which is used for this purpose is the use of decomposition technique. So basically decomposition is the strategy in which the project is divided into multiple parts or into specific parts, and this technique is basically a divide and conquer technique. So the project is divided into major functions and related activity, and the cost and effort estimate performed in each function is done in a stepwise fashion. So for each function which has been divided, the cost and efforts are calculated, and then the cost of the entire project in terms of money as well as effort is calculated by summing up the total cost. So basically there are several empirical estimation models which are used. So these models can complement the decomposition techniques which are used alone. Basically these models are used on historical data, so these may not be very accurate. Like for example, the models which are used lines of code or function points. So software cost estimate, they rely on good historical data, but sometimes it may not be very viable to use this kind of historical data, because these data items which may be calculated using a different set of technology, or because the type and the framework of hardware and software keeps changing. So therefore the reliance on historical data in terms of cost estimate may not be a very viable idea. So in decomposition technique, the problem that is the software project estimation is divided into smaller problems. So basically two types of decompositions are used. One is decomposition of the problem and the other is decomposition of the process, that is, you divide the problem into several smaller groups and you do it. The other is the entire procedure is divided into smaller and individual processes, and therefore the entire process can then be further undertaken as part of these separate activities. So before decomposition must be understood, it is important to understand that what is the general scope of the project, what is the major functions and performance reliability issues that the project must meet, and then it is required to generate an estimate of the project size. So accuracy of the estimate is strongly influenced by the accuracy of the size estimate, because if you are not able to understand the scope and size, then the estimate may not be very correct. So therefore, we generally see that there is a problem based estimation. So this is a direct measure in which we just calculate the lines of code, and the indirect measure where functional points are calculated. So functional points are individual points where a specific activity in the project is being done. So we begin with the bounded statement of the software scope, which clearly defines in an unambiguous manner what is the project about, and then we decompose this software into problem functions that can be individually estimated. So we apply the size measure to each function, that is for line of code or for functional point, or if it is an object oriented paradigm which is being used, then we divide it into objects, we divide it into classes and so on, and then we apply the baseline productivity metrics. For example, we use like the lines of code per month or function points per month, etc., and then the problem estimation is done. What is the complexity of the problem can be calculated from this kind of an estimate. So decomposition is actually different for lines of code versus functional point, because for lines of code decomposition must be more detailed, because you need to know exactly what is the size of the code, what is the number of lines which are required there. And for functional point, we are looking at an input output inquiry, we look at the data in files, we look at the interfaces, and then the planner uses historical data sometimes also, or intuition, which of course is less recommended. So basically different types of decomposition techniques will be used for a direct kind of project estimation, cost estimation, or an indirect kind of project cost estimation using decomposition. So basically we are make three estimate for each function. One is the optimistic estimate, the other is the pessimistic, and the third is the most likely estimate of the project cost. And then we compute 3 points of expected values, that is the most likely value, the worst case scenario, and the best case scenario. On that, then historical data or lines of code or functional point productivity data is applied, and in that gives a more realistic estimate of the way the project has to be handled or the way the estimates have to be created. So once these estimates are in hand, only then we can go about it. So if you talk about a process based estimation, so this is the most common technique for estimating project costs. So in this case, the process is decomposed in a smaller set of activities, and effort required to complete each activity is estimated. So the entire process now is divided. So it is not going to be a problem based, like you do not calculate the lines of code or you do not calculate the function point, but basically you do it for an entire activity or the entire problem per se. So this is these are the two ways in which project planning and monitoring activity estimates can be calculated. So once the estimates are in place, then it is the project monitoring plan which takes place, and this project monitoring will then later on, these estimates will later on help in controlling the quality of the project, to see whether the software quality, the software project is meeting the expectations as desired or not, because you have certain estimates and you have certain control values. So you can always compare the actual with the estimate, and if there is any kind of deviation, then it is the task of the project control team to see that that this kind of deviation is smoothened out. So basically this will be all in the context of project planning. We shall be continuing with a new topic in the next lecture. Till then, thank you.